Okay, welcome back to the Music with Matt podcast. I'm Wes.
And I'm John.
And today's the conclusion of our conversation with Lance Stewart, sociology PhD student.
And what's so cool is we're going to delve right back into the conversation about why people love listening to music on vinyl and so much more as well. The intersection with technology and even somewhat of a perspective on the psychological and cognitive aspects of it.
Let's jump right in. And even Lance, I'm curious too, like, and I know you're still sort of in the middle of this whole process and still kind of learning as you go, but like, what are some of the larger outcomes that you've seen as people relate to technology? Like, music's a big part of it, and the creative element's an interesting part of it, but I know oftentimes like there's that assumption and there's this sort of overwhelming like negativity around how technology has sort of like shaped our lives and now runs our lives in a lot of different ways. But have you seen any like counterbalance to that? Like,
yeah, there's a few answers I have to that. I'll see if I can keep them all in mind as I go through them. So I would say the first thing that I would say is that generally speaking, what I find most fascinating about how technology influences us, and you're right, like there's a lot of negative talk about it because there's a lot of concern and worry as to how it's going to be shaping us. I think it's very easy to focus on problems because problems are easier to identify than the things that we take for granted, right? Just by definition, we take certain things for granted. If things are not issues, if they benefited us in very subtle ways, or we've shaped our lives around those changes, we're not necessarily making it like a list of all the ways in which technology has helped us. But when it goes in a way that kind of works against what we'd like to see, or we're worried about the direction it's going to go, that's easy to hyperfixate on, right? What I find most fascinating is that in terms of this relationship between technology and our everyday lives, or just how we appreciate music and our relationship with music, is that as we learn from technology what is possible. Right. We see these new technologies come out, and what's really fascinating to me is that for most of us, there's kind of like a I don't know what kind of wording or imagery I'd like to use here, like kind of like a void or like a wall that's right up to what we know now. And because most of us are not, we're not designers in some way, we're not software engineers, we're not trying to find new modes of doing things. And so we just learned what's up to now. But when we look back and we look to earlier ways in which we used to listen to music and we compare it to now, we go, that is so inconvenient. That I would never go through all the steps to do that ever again. And so what I find most fascinating is that as we learn more about technology, what we really take for granted is how the way in which we view our lives is shaped by what is possible through those technologies. So in terms of, for example, digital music, we've gotten so used to music being portable, being easily integrated into our everyday lives, that we don't really think about how maybe we commute differently based on how we want to integrate music, how we work out and exercise differently based on how we integrate music. We tend to think of it the other way around because we tend to focus, understandably, on our own perspectives. We think, I'm the one who's deciding this, I'm the one who's doing this, without realizing all the ways in which the path that you really just see in front of you is your view, but it's shaped by what you think is possible. And that's very much to do with technology.
Absolutely, because I think like one of the conversations we had recently is this notion of how sometimes you can find yourself, if you're listening to music and you're just like, wow, I feel like I'm in a movie and this is the soundtrack to my movie. So that's a phenomenal thing, and that's like a sort of transcendental experience that can occur when listening to music. But sort of to reiterate what you've said, it's like, sure, you might shun certain aspects of new technology and things like that, but because of this new technology, you're able to just walk around and do your day-to-day thing and have this like soundtrack of music to accompany you. And it's like, without these advancements in technology, that wouldn't be possible. Even thinking about like the Discman example, it's like maybe you would go to do that and then you go, oh, it's skipping. It's skipping, yeah. Or like you're listening to a tape cassette and you're like, ooh, oh, and that's eating the ribbon of the tape. Like, there it goes. Like,
or like I want to listen to this song and I've got to like try to go fast forward through it and stuff like that.
And things like that. Whereas you're like, oh, if you really like an album, like, and your internet connection's not there, it's like you can just download it and then you can still just listen to it, and it's on this like small device that's in your pocket and like connected with headphones that maybe you don't even need. Like, it's not even connected with a wire anymore. It's just like all of these advancements that create this like fluidity to your day-to-day like life and how you just like consume music, like you said. It's a very interesting, I really appreciate that perspective, because it's like, you're right, it's so easy to just focus on, oh, well, technology does too much of this, so that's a bad thing and stuff like that. But you're like, yeah, but you haven't really realized like all of these things in this periphery of your experience and your day-to-day existence that have positively affected you know, your life and in this context how you consume music, you know. That's super interesting. And that also makes me think too about how back to that point of kind of even like the vinyl heads who really love vinyl still appreciate streaming music and accept it as just being part of that like experience and that day-to-day life.
When you love music, you just want more of it.
Of
like
course,
you're not just going to stop because it's not physically there. It's like, well, I still want to do, I still want to listen to it. I think another important thing to kind of say about this, and kind of like, you know, going on that you know, the beginning of the question you were talking about or asking about in terms of the negative effects of technology that is very easy to focus on. And I think, you know, the fact that, you know, vinyl music hasn't just disappeared, that it's continuing to rise, that it's so popular amongst people of all age groups, that I think it's a bit more like, if I'm being mean, it's a bit more on the alarmist scale. If I'm being more reasonable, it's like an understandable concern of how technology affects, you know, you hear all the time in terms of like attention span.
Right.
And, you know, how people just want, you know, and I really think people are taking what digital music can do and just really going too far with the possible consequences of that. Because if that were true, then why is it that the fastest growing, you know, format is vinyl?
Right.
And that, you know, it's growing fast even among young age groups that a lot of people tend to be alarmist about, right? When I talk to younger people, the only thing that really stopped them from maybe getting into vinyl when they were a teenager is the issue that we all had as teenagers, money, right? Like you can't afford it, right? And on that same note, when it comes to something like copyright infringement and piracy, it's understandable why it's highest among teenagers and people in the early 20s, but it has dropped off dramatically over the last 10 years. Like when I started my PhD, my first interest was in copyright infringement. I'm very fascinated by like, what are the conditions that lead to people wanting to pirate music and pirate other, you know, other media. And talking to people now in my interviews and asking them, almost everyone I've talked to has copyright infringed at some point in time. They pirated music at some point in time. I think most of us have, except for like the much older generations that I talked to, they didn't really kind of get into that, but nobody does anymore. And when I ask them, everyone has the same simple answer. It's like, well, why would I? Like, why go through all those steps? It's like, yeah, sure, it's free, but like the convenience of accessing anything I want, tracking what I want, making playlists, getting an algorithm, all sorts of different facets that essentially, you know, current services are better than piracy. Meanwhile, and this is more of my hypothesis, in like the early 2000s into like the early 2010s, I think it was more that, as I was saying before, as we learn from technology of what's possible, we raise the bar of our expectations of what we think should happen. And if the industry falls behind or it has difficulty catching up to those expectations, then I think it's something like piracy becomes more, you know, worth more valuable to people. Looking back, we're like, well, the inconveniences of piracy are just too much now because like like services have surpassed that. You can instantly access it. You can get it when you want. And yes, there's a monthly fee, but it kind of proves that piracy for most people was never really about money outside of teenagers who can't afford it and people from other countries who can't afford, you know, the $10 a month Spotify or, you know, Apple Music amount. That for the rest of us, it was never really about price. Because if it is about price, then no one would be buying Spotify even today, right? Like you could easily pirate whatever you want. People do it because it's a better service and it's worth the money, right? So
yeah, interesting.
That's a fascinating point, and you know, I totally see the validity to it. Like even something with like YouTube that is essentially free if you're willing to sit through a couple ads, right? You can access any song, music video, anything you could ever want, right? And again, build playlists and find new music that way and all those things, and it's pretty accessible for people,
and that's like an example of just like the technology and the positive presence of it as well. And I would be curious to know just, and again, this may be too broad, and feel free to sort of, you know, if you can't really answer this one, that's okay, but you know, we have very, very moderately touched upon this notion of sort of like the cognitive impacts of technology. And then, and I would be curious to know just if from the responses that you've had from people, what this sort of cognitive relationship would be like, perhaps maybe in relation to consuming music through a streaming service, i.e. like through this new technology, and then maybe as the sort of antithesis to that, the idea of like consuming it with vinyl, which, as
Yeah.
we've said, is sort of the opposite in all accounts, right?
Yeah.
I'm not sure if maybe you could speak to, again, like just the cognitive role or impact rather that maybe
Yeah.
like technologies have had, and maybe perhaps more specifically within consuming music, you know?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Like, there's a lot to kind of dive into when it comes to the cognitive elements, because it really depends on if we're looking at, as we kind of mentioned before, the low-hanging fruit when people talk about technological impact is like attention span, right?
Of course.
And all these other things. But outside of those kind of cognitive things, which I don't think holds a lot of weight, considering that everyone that I talk to, yes, the ease and access and just like, you know, the way in which you can really take for granted when you're listening to music using something like Spotify, Apple Music, other types of digital services. But, you know, the fact that people still want to sit down and listen to vinyl, or even if they're not really someone who listens to vinyl, to give music that attention, it kind of demonstrates that that's really not the kind of impact the technology has.
Right.
And I think it makes a lot of sense when you consider that, like, to anybody, and I think anyone would like resonate with this, the point of listening to music is not to easily access something. The point of listening to music is to feel something, right? To like experience that music, to listen to it, right? And so, you know, that commands different amounts of attention depending on if you want it in the background, if it's in the foreground, like if you're actively listening to it, or if you're just adding it to whatever you're doing. But it makes sense that, you know, attention span, or really trying to like, you know, going at it as quickly as you can, is not the end all be all, because that's not why people listen to music.
Right.
Instead, it makes sense that it's like people who love music will dedicate time to it, like we do with anything in our lives, right? Like if you love something enough, right? Like, just because, this might not be a good comparison to make, but like, just because you enjoy McDonald's on occasion doesn't mean that you don't like good food anymore, right? Like sometimes you want it because you're like, I just want to get that. But like that, like fast food doesn't replace good food.
Right.
Fast music, fast technology doesn't replace a good experience.
It's
right?
just a facet of it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Right. That's very interesting. And also, you know, you kind of said this earlier as well. It's just like so interesting how, you know, so many people listen to so much like different music, but there's just like such a broad and like a broad appreciation for it. And it's just like you said, where it's like, well, it's not about, I don't listen to music because of how easily I can access this song. Right. There's that intentionality behind it where you're like, no, I want to, you know, chase that emotion, or if I'm feeling a certain way and I want to stay within this emotion, it's just like and that also is just like such an interesting thing. And for what Wes and I do, where, you know, obviously we basically help folks, best case scenario, we help folks create their own music and help them record it and things like that. And it is just such a lovely thing where so many people listen to so many different types of music, but we all appreciate in this, like the fact that it's sort of this emotive language that we can quote unquote speak by listening to music. Right.
And so the more that you dive into that and think about that, the more kind of just commonsensical it is that vinyl is so popular and remains to be so popular, and how, you know, this idea of new formats, new technological advancements, they offer different ways of experiencing these things. But the whole point of music or any other type of art is the art itself, right? And so it can be adapted, it can be used in different ways. New technologies develop, so now we can listen to music differently. Like if we were to either go back in time or pluck someone out of time from like 100 years ago and bring them to now and be like, this is how you could experience music. It'd be really interesting to see their kind of perspectives. They might think like, oh, you're really just kind of watering down the experience because you really just only need to sit and watch it live and have like a, you know, a symphony or a band or something or an orchestra kind of in front of you. It's like, well, that's still true, and people still love and appreciate that. People have not stopped going to concerts just because they can access music whatever they want. They haven't listened to vinyl for that reason either. And, you know, I think it's easier, as I said before, to have these concerns or to think about it this way when it comes to music because of how ubiquitous and how widely loved and appreciated music is. When you compare it to other mediums, it becomes really understandable and like just easy to see that, for example, like you can Google any painting you want right now and just look at a JPEG of it. That doesn't mean that now that you've seen that picture, you're like, well, now I don't need to go to a museum. Well, no, like looking at the piece of art itself has an experience in itself. Right. If that's not an experience that appeals to you, I guess you're really not someone who likes fine art. That's cool. That's fine. But that doesn't replace that experience. You can't just, you know, fast track how you appreciate art through a digital means.
Right.
Yeah, and that's like again at the end of the day, the point of all of it, right? Is art, but specifically music, because this is a music-based podcast. It is just an avenue to emotion and feeling and all of those great things. And technology is sort of the conduit to that in so many different ways, right? And I think, you know, what's been really great about this conversation is that we've just really highlighted how technology is not necessarily a negative thing.
Yeah.
Right. It can help that sort of positive outcome when it comes to accessing art, when it comes to consuming it, when it comes to interacting with it, when it comes to the experiential piece or not, right? Or whether it's something, you know, that you put on while you're working out and just so something a little more passive that way. But that's this has been really, really fascinating, Lance. And one last question maybe that we have for you before we part ways, and this is something that is a MAP staple on the podcast.
Okay.
What kind of music do you listen to?
Yeah.
What do you listen to right now?
This is a real softball question. We started with the heavy hitters. Now you get the easy one.
Before I answer it, I just want to say, funnily enough, I start all of my interviews with that question.
Oh, no way.
So I start it that way. I find
great.
it such a fascinating question and a funny question to bring up because it's kind of the question that everyone's like, oh, like, what do I... Like, the answer that you usually hear is like, well, listen to a little bit of everything and this and that, right? So...
or everything except for country.
Except country.
Right.
Do you find that? Do you get that response?
Sometimes people... I find that people rarely mention things that they won't listen to.
Right.
And it might be because I'm seeking out and I'm searching for music lovers.
Right,
People who listen to like 20, 30 plus hours a week of music. And so they're not focused on what they don't want. They're focused on what they love, right?
Of course.
But that is the common answer is everything but country or metal. But on that note, I listen to metal music.
Yes.
Metal is my favorite genre.
Really?
Generally
That's
speaking,
amazing.
absolutely. Yeah.
Oh, no way.
I would generally say that if I could just locate like the music that I love listening to, I love listening to stimulating music.
Right.
I love listening to music that gives me tingles up the back of my neck. I guess everyone does, but like that's what does it for me, right? A piece of music that I can piece apart and break down. The kind of music that like my partner very much dislikes. I think she appreciates that I have such a specific interest in music, but she would never want to listen to it out loud. And it's the kind of music that like, you know, if sometimes it comes up, I'm sure it's happened to you as well. Like you're at a party and someone's like, oh, like what kind of music do you listen to? Like, Lance, I never hear the kind of music you listen to. Why don't you put on a song? And I'm like, no, we shouldn't. It's not for this setting. And I'll put it on and they'll be frightened. And I'll be like, well, yeah, that's what I love listening to, right?
This is why I opted not to do this. Yeah.
Yeah. So
that's so funny. And we ask this question all the time. It's a great way to, especially if you're with like a new group, fresh set of faces and things like that. It's just like a great way to kind of get a conversation going. And I think also it acts as like a reminder to be like, yeah, we're all here because we love music. And even if you listen to totally different types of music, there's always going to be this sort of like crossover where someone's like, oh, actually, I really love that artist too. I wouldn't normally listen to that, you know, so it's great. But yeah, hands down, I find, you know, it's so common where people are like, oh, I listen to everything but country. And or sometimes people are like, and what's the genre with all the screaming? Yeah, I don't like that either.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So and being a metalhead,
I get it though. I get it though. I understand why people don't like metal. It is supposed to be jarring.
Yeah.
And some people don't like that. I feel it's the same way with people who don't like, you know, like horror films. I'm like, I get it. You don't want to be scared.
Right.
Some of us want to feel that. Although to compare them though, and I had a good conversation with one of the people I was interviewing about this, who's also a metalhead, is that for those of us who really love metal, sometimes we listen to certain music because we want to be stimulated. We want to be like pumped up. Yeah. But it's not like it is for everybody else. There's a lot of metal music that actually, the more stimulating it is, the more calming it is for me. Like 100%. It really kind of narrows me down. Like I listen to music. I listen to metal music when I go grocery shopping. Right. I find it helps me not get overwhelmed by choices and like figuring things out, because that's the overwhelming part. The rest of my brain is nice and quiet, just listening to this barrage that's going on, right? That's super interesting. And
I think that you're onto something there, because it's like, if I think of, you know, your standard kind of like metalhead, someone who plays metal music, like and like dudes and bands and stuff like that. Yeah. It's like, if you watch an interview with them, they're not as intense as the music that they play. They're usually just like
are always the nicest people you've ever met.
And they're like, I just like to hang out and play like Dungeons and Dragons, and like, you know, I shred on the guitar every now and again and stuff like that. It's just like, I love that. And I was even saying this recently, like, I was watching an Amon Amarth documentary, and I was joking with Wes. I'm like, I just love how chill they are, and
So
they're just
chill,
like,
yeah.
and they like their music's not particularly aggressive, but at the same time, it's still metal. So like to your average person listening to it, they're like, that's pretty aggressive, and they're like, yeah, like we get together and we play the guitars and it sounds good, so we like to play.
Isn't it
like,
funny?
it's the best.
Especially like Scandinavian metal. You think they're all gonna be like insane, and you're just like, no, they're the most calm, like just really
it's so
chill.
great. And I also love, this is like a bit more specific, but like having played in a metal band and like seeing metal shows, is I also love, it's kind of the same thing, the sound check when the vocalist is doing a sound check and they're like, okay, can we test the mic? They're like, yeah. Okay, go ahead. And they just go, and they go, yeah, that sounds great. Thanks so much.
The contrast between
exactly.
like something that sounds like coming out of a horror film, and then it's like, oh, thanks.
And they're like, actually, can I get a little bit more on the monitor? Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks. Yeah, everything sounds great. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
So, and I gotta ask, like, what kind of metal specifically do you like in terms of like genre of bands or something like that?
Oh, so
or what have you been listening to lately?
Death metal, black metal.
Yes,
I would say. In the last year, I would say my favorite band that I've discovered in the last year. I feel bad that I didn't know them earlier. I think it's like this for every band that you discover that you're like, this is one of my new favorites. Like, oh, how did I not know about this before? Rivers of Nile.
Oh yeah,
Love Rivers of Nile. Their newest album was the first one I listened to, which I really love. I actually love how much more. I don't know how to describe it. How much more stretched out and paced it is. Mm-hmm. I love their previous album. I don't think that was I think maybe that wasn't their first. Their previous album to this newest one. That has a lot more like individual songs that you could listen to as opposed to something that's more cohesive and strung together.
Yeah.
That previous album is one that I like to listen to on the go. Their newest album is one that I would buy on vinyl because I would want to listen to it song by song. How previous songs actually set up the mood you should be in to feel subsequent songs. And I recently got back into, I think I do this with bands or artists every once in a while. Got back into Behemoth. I hadn't listened to Behemoth for a while. The Satanist is just like, obviously, like I realize that's kind of like, mentioning like just a common album, but like it's still so wonderful. It holds up so 100%. Well. And my favorite band of all time that I go back to a lot is the Mars Volta. I'm huge Mars Volta.
Right, because that's like technically not metal, but that's something that just fills the...
There's a lot
blowing
going on.
the back of your head out with the music,
100%.
right?
And that's like the thing that I kind of joke about with metal music is it's kind of like where someone like, say, Miles Davis was known for this sort of sparse nature of his playing. There would be a lot of open space and a few notes would come in and then there would be more open space. And metal is essentially the opposite, where they're like, oh, is there some available space? Well, let's throw in a drum fill. Let's throw in some like, yeah. And it's like even like audibly for like how it's mixed and mastered and stuff like that. It's just like, left to right in your how you consume it. It's just like every square inch of that is just consumed by a sound, which is amazing. And which is also what I love about that too. And do you get the same kind of response from if you were to say listen to some more like technical jazz or like do you okay,
technical jazz, math rock, that kind of stuff. Like I like the stimulating stuff, and I also like quieter, more like but I think for me quieter, more soft, less intense music is easier for something that I still want to listen to, but a little bit more on the passive side rather than the active side.
Yes, that's a great point.
I still want to capture a mood. I still want to fill the air and fill my ears with something. When I really want to focus on music, I want it to be high. I want to be overstimulated. I really want to. I want subsequent listens through to be like, oh, I didn't notice that little bit, that little teeny, that moment, in
like
that one
Easter
song,
eggs,
that little thing that really just. And now I appreciate that element. I'm just adding another layer of appreciation to it.
Absolutely. Right? I totally reciprocate that sentiment. And even again, because like we focus in a bit more on like audio engineering is like, I love that appreciation too, where it's like, oh, that one melodic phrase that you heard earlier that was in the forefront, now it's like kind of in the background and it's like panned to the right, but it's still there. And it's like, you can tick that box where you're like, oh, there's just like so much to listen to. And
it's kind of like, and I realize I'm going to say this in terms of like a lot of the reading that I've been doing for the research that I'm writing on right now. But it's like this for a lot of different artworks, right? Like it's the same reason why, like, if you go to an art gallery and you're looking at this, incredible painting, it's not like the first time you view it, you're like, now I've seen everything. You go back and you're like, that's a detail I didn't notice last time.
Right.
And it adds so much to it. It literally colors the rest of it. Like
Right.
it literally influences everything else that I've experienced in this painting. And so with music, it's the same way. It's like little moments, little things that you appreciate more the more you listen to it. And it's the same for music that isn't as hyper stimulating,
Right.
but I like the hyper stimulating stuff.
Yeah, and this
sure.
is like this is the beautiful part about music, because I would consider myself the opposite almost. Like
Right.
faster, busier stuff is
Yeah.
is definitely more passive for me when I'm doing something or
Interesting,
traveling or kind of on in the background. Whereas for me, like more melodic and sort of roots rock is sort of my favorite stuff to listen to, and that's a little bit more sparse. And like John, you just said, like the empty spaces almost, for me at least, carry so much weight, right? And
Yeah.
you just like you notice so many little things each time you go back. But again, this is the beautiful part about art, right? Like there's we can look at the same thing and have two totally different perspectives,
Exactly.
Yeah.
based on everything. But Lance, before we get too long here, I knew as soon as you mentioned metal, this last segment was gonna take quite a while. But
I'm not done yet, by the way. Just for the
I know,
record, we
John-
just got started.
John's getting going.
This was the prologue to a very, very long conversation. Yeah.
But thanks so much for being on the show. We,
Yeah.
we really appreciate your findings, your wisdom here, and just an overall great conversation. I
thanks
think
for having me.
things like this always just personally make me feel a little more hopeful for everything in the way like we interact and utilize and sort of live with technology and the benefits of it. Right. So thanks for sharing that. Is there anything you want to plug before we move on? Any
I got to be honest, I don't really have
That's
much
cool.
of anything
Yeah,
to plug.
that's fine.
I'm one of those conventional, I guess like, I don't know if I would call myself an academic. I'm just a PhD student, but like, I don't really have socials that I use. I don't really have anything that's going on.
No,
I'm just
hey.
working on my own stuff. And
Yeah.
like the stuff that gets attention is in academic journals. So that's kind of outside the point.
Well, that's
Nice.
great, man, and we'll definitely be in touch because as you kind of navigate that world, like we would love to kind of keep checking in and
Yeah,
seeing
for
where it
sure.
goes.
Absolutely. I would love to come back and chat about it.
Absolutely. Yeah, that would be super cool, especially like check back in a little bit. And maybe somehow these recordings will also help your
Absolutely.
longitudinal studies, right? You'd be like, here's what I was talking about at this time, 6 months later or whatever.
Yeah, because I'm in the middle of the process of kind of working through different, like I have all of this data to work from and kind of identifying different interesting things that I could write about. And so what I'm focusing on right now is very much that kind of vinyl experience and what it means to kind of experience vinyl in that way and how it's kind of irreplaceable in its own self. But like, as new kind of papers develop, I'd love to come back and chat about that.
And again, like just to sort of reciprocate what Wes said, is one thing I really appreciate about this conversation. It was like such a cool perspective for us to hear because again, we are coming from a place of more like music creation and sort of like the recording of music and sort of helping people do that. And that's an extension of our own experiences and like what we like to do from like playing and recording music. But something that we don't often really think too much about is sort of that idea of like how it is people consume their music. So this conversation was amazing and it was so cool to hear these different perspectives that you've gained from your own research and these conversations that you've had. So thank you again so much for being with us. It was awesome, and
it was really great to come in and chat about it.
Yeah.
It's one of those things where I sit down and I think about this all day every day as I'm doing this work. But like just to talk about it like this,
Nice
is
to get it off
fantastic. So it's,
sometimes.
it's
That's
great
awesome.
to just chat about it.
And also just really quick, like I guess next Rivers and Al show I'll see you in the mosh pit, I guess, right?
I guess so for sure.
I'll just bump into you and be like, hey Lance, what's up,
Absolutely.
man?
Hey,
Your elbow almost broke my nose.
happen.
How's it going, man?
There it is.
That's the final note. Yeah.
On that note, thanks for listening. If anybody listening to the show kind of got anything from today, please reach out to us on social media and send some love, send a comment or a question. We'd be more than happy to kind of address it next time. But thanks for listening and stay tuned for more music with Matt.